It was still dark when Haley Marin stepped out the front door that morning. The sun hadn't yet breached the hills around Ridgetop Hollow, a small town surrounded by dense pine forest and forgotten back roads. The streets were silent, save for the soft rustle of trees in the breeze and the distant hum of waking wildlife. At 16, Haley had a quiet ritual: morning walks before school, earbuds in, hoodie up, the world still half asleep around her. She was a creature of habit, always at the same time, always the same route. Her mother, Diane Marin, remembered hearing the door close at exactly 6:17 a.m. She was half asleep, the coffee pot just starting to drip in the kitchen. She assumed she'd see Haley again in 40 minutes, flushed cheeks, earbuds wrapped around her fingers, kicking off her shoes in the doorway like always. But that moment never came. By 7, Diane started pacing the front window. At 7:30, she called Haley's phone. No answer. By 7:45, she'd walked the neighborhood twice, calling her daughter's name, phone pressed to her ear, hoping for a ringtone nearby. At 8:04 a.m., she dialed 911. Officers arrived within 15 minutes. The Marins weren't the type to overreact. Haley had no history of running away, no fights with her parents, no signs of distress. She wasn't a loner, but she wasn't a social butterfly either. She kept a close circle of friends, got decent grades, and had recently been saving for a second-hand camera. She wanted to study photography. She'd mentioned starting a photo blog about abandoned places in Oregon, but it never sounded like more than a side hobby. By noon, local search teams were combing the trailheads along the southern edge of the town. A few kids at school said they'd seen her walking past the gas station near Ridgeview Drive, earbuds in, eyes down, not stopping to talk. That was around 6:30 a.m. Surveillance footage confirmed it, grainy and distant but clear enough. Haley walked with a steady pace, no one behind her, nothing suspicious. That was the last time she was ever seen. Her phone pinged once more at 6:46 a.m., a weak signal bouncing off a nearby cell tower. Authorities traced it to a rough location at the edge of Gifford Pine Forest, just before the terrain drops toward a shallow creek and splinters off into multiple unmarked trails. After that, her phone went dead. No calls, no texts, no more pings. Search teams fanned out in all directions. Helicopters circled overhead. Volunteer groups scoured the forest calling her name, checking ravines and riverbeds. For 3 straight days, search dogs combed the area, alerting once near the creek, but losing the scent minutes later. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints, no torn clothing, just a dead trail, one of those cases that left even seasoned deputies uneasy. Detective Ray Collins, who had worked with missing persons for 2 decades, later described it as too clean, as if Haley had simply stepped off the trail and vanished into thin air. Friends were brought in, teachers questioned, neighbors interviewed. Everyone said the same thing. Haley was quiet, responsible, a little shy, but grounded. She wasn't the type to sneak off, to hitchhike, to run away. Her journal, later found in her nightstand, was filled with doodles, photography notes, and a list of old buildings she wanted to explore. But no signs of distress, no confessions, no mention of anyone following her, no hidden relationships or messages. The weather had been clear that day, no rain to wash away evidence, no wind strong enough to explain missing clues. Just a cold October morning that held its silence a little too tightly. By the end of the week, the story made local headlines. Teen girl missing in Ridgetop Hollow. A photo circulated, Haley smiling on a hiking trail, brown hair tied back, a camera around her neck. Tips started to flood in. People thought they saw her at a rest stop on Highway 14 or near a grocery store an hour south. Each lead was followed. Each one went nowhere. Diane held onto hope. She kept Haley's room untouched, kept her phone line active. She started walking the same route each morning, retracing her daughter's path like some kind of silent ritual, hoping to feel something others missed. Some mornings she thought she heard something, rustling behind trees, distant footsteps. But it was always just the forest. For weeks, then months, Ridgetop Hollow remained frozen in that moment. A missing girl. No answers. A mother waiting by the door every day for 8 years. And though time passed, something about that morning refused to settle. because deep down, in the quiet spaces between search reports and police files, there remained one question no one could shake. How does a 16-year-old girl disappear in broad daylight on a route she walked every single morning, without a single soul seeing a thing? And that question would remain unanswered until a dog started digging. In the first 24 hours, Ridgetop Hollow transformed from a sleepy Oregon town into the center of something darker. What began as a missing teenager call quickly escalated into a full-scale emergency. Haley's name was printed on makeshift flyers before the sun went down. Her photo, smiling, chin tilted slightly to the right, was pinned to telephone poles, gas station windows, and the corkboard outside the library. That same evening, volunteers showed up in droves, forming search lines, combing through trails, brush, and roadside ditches. It wasn't just concern. It was disbelief. Girls like Haley didn't just vanish, not here. By the next morning, the Jackson County Sheriff's Office brought in a chopper from Medford. It hovered low over the forest, following the creek bed where Haley's phone had last pinged. From above, the woods looked endless, thick, overgrown, quiet. Search dogs had already been through once, alerting briefly near the waterline before the scent evaporated. Some believed she'd fallen into the creek and been carried off. Others weren't so sure. Detective Ray Collins took point on the case. He was seasoned, practical, not prone to speculation. But this one didn't sit right. He later admitted, in an off-the-record conversation, that the scene felt undisturbed. No broken branches, no blood, no signs of panic or flight. If Haley had been taken, it had been clean. Too clean. And if she'd run, she hadn't taken anything with her. Her wallet was still at home, her phone had gone silent, and she had never drawn cash from her account. Rumors spread faster than facts. Within 2 days, the town was split between 3 theories. Haley had been abducted, killed by a wild animal, or had chosen to disappear. The animal attack theory came from the local news. A segment featured a biologist speculating about black bears or cougars in the area. But no blood, no torn clothing, and no remains made that unlikely. The abduction theory held more weight, but there were no witnesses, no strange cars, no tire tracks, just an empty forest and a cold silence. The third theory, the one that hurt the most, was that Haley had run away. Some kids at school whispered about it quietly, that she had a boyfriend nobody knew about, that she'd wanted out. But her friends shut that down quickly. Haley was private, not secretive. She loved routine, she wasn't impulsive, and she had no history of mental health issues, no signs of distress. Her mother confirmed she hadn't packed a bag. There were no missing clothes, no missing shoes. Everything was exactly where it should have been, except for Haley. A week in, authorities gained access to her phone records. The logs revealed no unusual calls or messages leading up to the disappearance, just a string of routine texts to her best friend Mallory about homework and a movie they were supposed to watch that weekend. But there was one detail that stood out. Haley's last song played on Spotify was at 6:44 a.m., less than 2 minutes before the final phone ping. The song stopped mid-play. Then, nothing. It was as if her phone had simply been shut off or destroyed. At the same time, the journal entry surfaced. Tucked deep in one of the spiral-bound notebooks on her bookshelf, the page read, "I keep hearing footsteps when I walk in the mornings, always behind me, always stopping when I stop. Maybe I'm being paranoid, but it's happened 3 times now. It's not a squirrel." Investigators found it unnerving, but inconclusive. There was no name, no description, no follow-up, just a teenage girl writing something that could have easily been brushed off as imagination. The Marin's house became a nerve center for grief. Haley's mother rarely slept. Her father, Alan, organized nightly vigils and coordinated with search teams. He hung on to a belief that she had simply gotten lost and would walk out of the forest dazed but alive. But as days turned into weeks, the tone changed. The town's mood soured. Confidence gave way to speculation. People began locking their doors. Teenagers weren't allowed out past dark. Strangers got suspicious looks. For a place that once boasted its safety, Ridgetop Hollow began to feel fractured. paranoid. The forest, once a backdrop for summer hikes and family picnics, became something else entirely. People avoided the trails. Some swore they heard strange sounds near the creek at night, branches snapping, whispers on the wind. Local hunters reported areas of the woods that felt off, where animals wouldn't go, where even their dogs grew anxious. These claims were unofficial, anecdotal, but in the vacuum of answers, they filled the space. Detective Collins brought in a profiler from Portland. She reviewed the case files, the phone records, and the journal entries. Her conclusion was cautious. If this was an abduction, it had been premeditated and planned by someone who knew Haley's route and habits. If it wasn't, then they were missing something, a piece of information buried deep beneath silence or shame. But no one came forward. 8 days after Haley disappeared, the official search was scaled back. The sheriff's office cited resource constraints. They asked for continued community support, but admitted, quietly, they were out of leads. Diane Marin refused to stop. She created a Facebook group, offered a $10,000 reward, and reached out to anyone who would listen. But with no new evidence, no sightings, and no movement, the case slipped slowly into cold status. And yet, there was always this sense, shared by detectives, neighbors, and her family, that the truth wasn't far. That someone knew something. That Haley hadn't just disappeared, but had been hidden. Quietly. Deliberately. Somewhere close, it would take nearly a decade for anything to surface. And when it did, it wouldn't come from a breakthrough in forensics or a witness with a guilty conscience. It would come from the dirt, clawed up by a dog in someone else's backyard. By the end of November, the ground had started to freeze, and so had the case. Haley's disappearance no longer occupied the front page of the local newspaper. The flyers, once freshly printed and stapled to every corner post, had begun to fade and curl in the rain. The town of Ridgetop Hollow settled into a tense silence, the kind that comes when people start whispering more than searching. The investigation had begun with momentum. Over 40 tips had poured in during the first 2 weeks, some credible, most not. One, in particular, stood out. A man named Garrett Lowe had recently moved into a rundown cabin off Crooked Pine Road, about a mile from where Haley's phone had last pinged. Neighbors described him as standoffish, with long periods of silence interrupted by bursts of noise late at night, tools clanging, shouting, sometimes music at full volume. He had no solid alibi for the morning Haley disappeared. When deputies questioned him, he said he'd been asleep until 10 a.m., but no one could confirm it. He was brought in, fingerprinted, questioned for hours. His car was searched. Dogs sniffed the property. For a few days, it felt like this was it, the break the family had been praying for. But nothing connected him to Haley, no trace evidence, no inconsistencies in his story, and no criminal history. The suspicion that had hovered around him like a dark cloud evaporated, and he was quietly released. Locals continued to side-eye him at the gas station, but legally, he was in the clear. Then came the Forest Ranger report. On the morning of November the 12th, 17 days after Haley vanished, a veteran ranger named Denny Whitlock radioed in an unusual sighting. He claimed he saw a girl dart across a fire service road near Elk Ridge, barefoot, covered in mud, and visibly shaken. She didn't look at him, didn't stop when he called out. She disappeared into the trees before he could catch up. Denny described her as young, maybe a teen, with long brown hair and what looked like a sweatshirt tied around her waist. When shown a photo of Haley, he hesitated, then nodded. He couldn't say for certain, but it looked close. Search crews immediately converged on Elk Ridge. It was about 7 miles from Haley's home, farther than expected, but not impossible. Especially if she'd wandered off or been taken and later escaped. Helicopters were dispatched again. A thermal drone was used, but once more, the trail led nowhere. No footprints, no items of clothing, no indication that anyone had been there. Denny's sighting was never corroborated. It became another frustrating thread that led into emptiness. Weeks turned to months. The search teams dwindled. Volunteers went back to their jobs. The vigil candles were replaced with winter decorations. Detective Collins still worked the case, but the leads had slowed to a trickle. Every few days, a new tip would come in. Someone saw a girl on a hiking trail in Idaho, or a waitress in Eugene matched her description. Each one was logged, followed up, and ruled out. The same routine: hope, effort, disappointment. Inside the Marin household, time stopped. Diane refused to take down Haley's missing poster on the fridge. She left her daughter's room untouched, blankets still bunched from the last time she'd made her bed, phone charger still plugged into the wall. Alan, Haley's father, buried himself in work. He rarely spoke during dinner anymore. Sometimes he'd go days without saying her name. The grief between them hung like fog, constant, shapeless, and suffocating. Haley's younger brother, Evan, started acting out at school. He punched a classmate for saying his sister was probably dead. He drew pictures in class, mostly forests, dark and endless. A counselor was brought in. He wouldn't talk, just shrugged when they asked questions. At home, he began avoiding the kitchen window that faced the trail where Haley used to return from her walks. As winter gave way to spring, something in the town shifted. People still cared, but not in the same way. They had jobs, lives, and other worries. Conversations about Haley grew less frequent, and when they did come up, they were quieter, more cautious. There was always an edge to it, a hesitation, a need to say something that sounded hopeful, even when they didn't believe it anymore. That's when the rumors started to fill the gaps left by facts. Some believed Haley had been groomed online, had left willingly, and was now too ashamed to come back. Others were convinced she'd been abducted by someone passing through, an out-of-towner, a drifter, maybe even a trucker passing along the nearby highway. There were even whispers of something darker, that she'd discovered something, had seen something she wasn't supposed to. Theories with no foundation, just the kind of quiet hysteria that builds when no truth is offered. The sheriff's department reduced active investigation hours. Haley's name was added to the state's cold case roster. Her file sat on a shelf among dozens of others, some older, some newer, all of them waiting. Detective Collins still revisited it now and then, rereading the journal entry about the footsteps, revisiting the cell tower ping, tracing the map with a pen that had long since run dry. And despite everything, the time, the theories, the emptiness, Diane never moved. She refused to sell the house. She kept the porch light on every night, like someone who still believed the front door might open, like someone who thought that if her daughter was out there, somewhere, lost or scared or hiding, she'd know to come back to that one constant: home. But what no one knew, not the sheriff's office, not the search teams, not even Diane, was that something had been left behind, something small, buried, forgotten. And it would take 8 years, a dog, and a garden to finally bring it to the surface. The Marin house used to be full of noise, slamming doors, mismatched music coming from 2 rooms at once, the scrape of dinner plates over conversation. But after Haley disappeared, the silence took over, slowly at first, then all at once. Conversations faded to nods, family dinners turned into quick meals eaten separately. Every room in the house began to carry the weight of something missing. By the spring of the following year, Alan Marin had moved into a small rental on the other side of town. There was no formal announcement, no big fight, just bags quietly packed and a note left on the kitchen counter that said, "I can't keep doing this." He still saw Evan on weekends and made appearances at the vigils, but something had changed in him. His voice had flattened, like it hurt too much to say her name out loud. Diane didn't ask him to stay. She didn't beg. She just turned back to the wall of maps she was building in the living room, tacking another red string between cell tower coordinates and a creek trail. Diane had become consumed by the absence. At first, she'd held on to hope like any mother would. She joined every missing persons forum, called police departments in other states, followed up on sightings herself. But as months passed and birthdays came and went without a single clue, that hope started to mutate. It didn't disappear. It calcified, hardened into a kind of relentless, unblinking need to find something. She moved into Haley's room. Not figuratively, literally. Her own bed stayed untouched as she slept under her daughter's posters, curled up in the same sheets Haley had kicked off the night before she vanished. She began taking notes on every search report herself, building timelines that the investigators had already abandoned. She memorized every number in Haley's phone records. even the disconnected ones, especially the disconnected ones. Evan, barely 11 when his sister disappeared, stopped talking almost entirely. At school, teachers said he stared out the window during class, rarely responding when called on. At home, he became a ghost. He kept the door to his room shut. Sometimes Diane would hear the TV on in the middle of the night, static or low-volume cartoons, but he never emerged. Once, she found him sitting in the hallway at 3 a.m., wearing Haley's old hoodie, just staring at the front door. Therapists were recommended. Diane declined. She didn't believe this was something they could work through. It wasn't grief. It wasn't a loss. It was something more liminal, something unfinished, a story waiting for its ending. She couldn't move forward because nothing had ended. Haley hadn't died, at least not officially. And until there was a body, a clue, a footprint, Diane refused to close the door on anything. The community tried to support them, at least in the beginning. Vigils were organized every few months, usually near the trailhead where Haley's phone last pinged. Neighbors left candles and flowers. Her classmates made tribute videos. But over time, the turnout shrank. People got tired, not out of cruelty, but because the absence had become normal. The town had slowly reshaped itself around the void. By year 2, the case had become a memory. The Facebook page Diane maintained was still active, but the comments had slowed to a trickle. She still updated it every week, sometimes with old photos, sometimes with pleas to keep looking. She shared posts about other missing girls, mostly as a way of reminding people that the story wasn't over, that stories like this never end the way they should. Inside the house, things grew stranger. Diane began keeping a recorder on her nightstand. She said sometimes she heard movement in the walls or the creak of the front door handle turning just slightly. She had a theory that someone had been inside the house the night before Haley vanished. Maybe it wasn't about the trail or the woods. Maybe it started closer to home. Detective Collins visited from time to time, mostly to touch base. He never promised anything, but he didn't forget her. He'd later say that every time he walked into that house, he felt like he was stepping into a shrine, not just to Haley, but to everything that had never been answered. The years rolled on, marked not by birthdays or holidays, but by how long it had been since the last viable lead. Diane had calendars where instead of writing dentist or grocery, she marked time like a prison wall. Day 582, no word. Day 643, new tip, nothing found. Her walls were covered in printouts, satellite maps, notes scribbled in pen and marker and pencil. The house wasn't really a house anymore. It was a case file. People began to talk, quietly. Some said Diane had lost touch, that she was making herself sick chasing shadows, that she was hurting Evan with the weight of her obsession, but no one said it to her face. Because underneath the rumors, there was a shared, quiet guilt, a sense that everyone had stopped looking too soon, that maybe they'd all played a part in letting Haley slip further away. By the end of the second year, even Diane had stopped talking about hope. What remained wasn't hope, it was fixation, a kind of emotional rigor mortis that kept her locked in place, unable to grieve, unable to move on, unable to let go. The girl was gone, but the search never ended, and in the middle of it all, buried in the silence and the walls and the woods and the years, something remained untouched, a trace, a sliver, a piece of the story that no one had seen. Yet, something that would not stay buried forever. It was a quiet Sunday in late March of 2025 when Jordan and Lexi Rowe noticed their new rescue dog acting strange in the backyard. They'd just moved into a fixer-upper on Sycamore Hill, a modest property tucked behind a row of evergreens, less than 2 miles from the Marin residence. The place had been empty for years, overgrown and forgotten, until the Rowes bought it with plans to renovate and start fresh. They were still settling in when their dog, a German Shepherd mix named Murphy, started pacing the back fence line with unusual urgency. At first, they thought he'd caught the scent of a mole or rabbit. But when he began digging, deep, frantically refusing to stop, Lexi came over, annoyed, expecting to find a half-chewed stick or maybe a dead squirrel. Instead, she spotted something strange. Murphy had torn into a dense patch of hard soil, his claws hitting something just beneath the surface. It wasn't a bone, but plastic. Thick, torn in places, discolored by time. Lexi crouched down and carefully pulled it loose, thinking maybe it was leftover garbage from a previous tenant, but the bundle had weight to it. She peeled it back just enough to glimpse what was inside, something dark, tangled, and metallic. They called the police within the hour. By the time detectives arrived, the Rows were standing in the driveway, visibly shaken. The plastic bundle, now fully unearthed, contained fabric scraps, clumps of hair, and what appeared to be a rusted bracelet with tiny charms, some missing, some still intact. The clasp was broken, but one of the charms was unmistakable, a tiny silver camera. That detail hit hard. Within a day, forensic analysts had cross-checked photos from the original 2017 missing persons report. In one of the last known images of Haley Marin, she was wearing a bracelet with 4 charms, a camera, a star, a book, and a music note. Her mother later confirmed that she'd worn it every morning, including the day she disappeared. The bracelet was hers. The excavation was slow and deliberate. The area was cordoned off and cadaver dogs brought in. A partial set of human remains was recovered just beneath the topsoil, no more than 3 feet down. There was no casket, no markings, just plastic, decayed cloth, and scattered bones. The condition of the burial was haphazard, not like a grave prepared with intention, but something hurried. Maybe I even panicked. The media caught on within 48 hours. "Break-in 8-year-old cold case," the headlines read. News vans parked on Sycamore Hill. For those who had lived in Ridgetop Hollow in 2017, it felt like a wound reopening. Some had tried to forget. Others had never stopped wondering. But now, with something physical, tangible, there was hope again. Or, at the very least, a path forward. Detective Ray Collins, now nearing retirement, returned to the case immediately. He visited the site personally, standing at the edge of the garden where the remains were discovered. It was difficult to describe the feeling. Relief, maybe, but not peace. It wasn't a full skeleton. Only partial remains had been recovered, primarily from the torso and legs. No skull, no arms, no shoes, no phone, no clothing that could confirm identity. DNA testing was expedited. Diane Marin was notified in person. It had been 8 years. In that time, she had imagined every version of this day. Finding her daughter, burying her daughter, never knowing either way. She'd played each possibility out in her head until they became more memory than theory. But this wasn't closure, not yet. What they'd found wasn't enough to prove anything conclusively, not until the lab results came in. Over the next 3 weeks, investigators combed through the Rose property. The backyard was dug out completely. Ground-penetrating radar was used. The house itself was searched. Cadaver dogs alerted briefly near a rusted-out tool shed, but nothing was found inside. The property records were pulled. Before the house was purchased by the Rose, it had sat empty for 5 years, bank-owned and deteriorating. Before that, it had belonged to a man named Russell Ames. Ames had lived alone, worked as a handyman, and left town abruptly sometime in early 2018. No forwarding address, no relatives listed, just a single DMV record and a suspended driver's license. At the time, his name had come up only briefly in the original investigation. He'd done yard work for homes near the trail where Haley walked, but he hadn't owned a vehicle and didn't match any descriptions from tipsters. No one had looked deeper. Now, everything has shifted. Detective Collins filed a subpoena for bank records, employment history, anything to find Ames' current location. But there was nothing. No credit activity, no tax returns. It was like he'd vanished, just like Haley had. The bracelet was sent to a separate lab for trace evidence. The rust had made testing difficult, but fibers were found inside the clasp, consistent with the type of sweatshirt Haley was last seen wearing. Then, finally, the DNA results came in. The remains were a match. It was Haley. The news spread quickly. For most in town, it answered the question they'd feared for years. But for her family, for Diane and Evan, it only raised more. If her body was buried here, how had no one found it sooner? Why only part of her? And if Amy's had done this, where was he now? And most disturbing of all, what else had he left behind? Within hours of the discovery, the backyard on Sycamore Hill was locked down. Yellow tape stretched around the property line, and uniformed officers stood at either end of the drive to keep away neighbors and reporters. The excavation was slow, methodical. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was potentially the final resting place of a missing girl whose name had haunted Ridgetop Hollow for nearly a decade. What started as a dog digging in soft soil had now become the focus of a forensic investigation that reached back 8 years. Cadaver dogs confirmed it quickly. There were more remains beneath the garden bed, scattered, shallow, and degraded. The soil there had compacted over time, which made the work delicate. Each inch of dirt was sifted by hand. By the end of the second day, search teams had uncovered fragments of a human pelvis, parts of a femur, a vertebrae, and strands of hair still knotted in deteriorated cloth. The clothing was too damaged to identify, but fibers were preserved. Analysts would later determine they matched the general color and material of the hoodie Haley Marin had been wearing when she vanished. Still, it wasn't enough, not yet. The bones were consistent with a teenage female. Age estimation put her between 14 and 18. The soil layering and decomposition suggested the body had been underground for approximately 7 to 8 years. All timelines pointed to Haley. But without dental records or a full skeleton, the identity couldn't be confirmed immediately. Investigators hoped the bracelet would help. The charm details matched perfectly, but legally it was still circumstantial. And there was a larger problem. The remains were incomplete. No skull, no rib cage, no arms. The lower body was present, but the rest had either been removed or never buried there to begin with. This changed the nature of the case. A hasty burial was one thing. A dismembered body was something else entirely. Investigators stopped treating the site as a solo grave. They began treating it as a potential dumping ground, one of possibly several. Forensic teams brought in ground-penetrating radar. The backyard was scanned in grids. Each alert was flagged and re-excavated. Small bones were found near a rusted water pipe, but they turned out to be animal. A button was recovered, cracked and weathered, but unremarkable. Then they found what looked like an old gardening spade, buried several feet deeper than normal. A tool rusted to the point of collapse, but with what appeared to be tiny fibers clinging to the handle. It was bagged and sent for testing. As the property was combed for evidence, focus shifted to the home's history. Records showed that it had remained vacant from late 2019 until the Rose purchased it in early 2025. During that time, it was held by a bank following a foreclosure. Before the bank, the house belonged to a man named Russell Ames. He'd lived there alone from 2015 to early 2018. The timeline was impossible to ignore. Haley Marin disappeared in October 2017. Ames left town roughly 4 months later. According to old property management notes, Ames had fallen behind on utilities. He'd been issued multiple citations for failing to maintain the yard and had received complaints from neighbors about loud noise and strange activity at night, tools, hammering, movement well after midnight. But none of it had triggered a formal investigation. At the time, he was just a reclusive, low-income handyman living alone in a decaying rental. Nothing out of the ordinary. Detective Collins had interviewed Ames once, briefly, during the early days of the original investigation. Ames' name had come up when compiling a list of contractors who worked near the trailhead, but he had no record, no priors, and nothing suspicious in his statements. At the time, there was no physical evidence linking him to Haley's disappearance, so the inquiry never went deeper. Now, everything pointed back to him. Officers tried to track him down, but Ames had vanished. He hadn't filed taxes since 2018. No active phone, no driver's license renewals, no rental agreements, no employment records. His last known bank transaction was a cash withdrawal, an ATM in southern Idaho, February 22, 2018. Since then, nothing. It was as if he'd disappeared on purpose. Diane Marin was informed that the remains were highly likely to be Haley's, but she wasn't given access to them, not yet. The medical examiner needed time to extract DNA. The bones had to be cleaned, examined, and compared. It was a painful waiting period, one she'd been through before, except this time there was something real, something physical, something undeniable. The bracelet was delivered to the lab for trace analysis. Investigators were looking for hair, skin cells, anything that could place Haley or someone else at the scene. It was worn and rusted, but the clasp still held. Inside the tiny crevices of the charms, lab techs found microscopic fibers. They couldn't say much yet, but preliminary results suggested some of the fibers weren't synthetic. They were natural, possibly hair, possibly not hers. For the first time in 8 years, there was more than a theory. There was a location, a suspect, a pattern. The implications were devastating. Because if this was Haley and the body was incomplete, it meant one of two things. Someone had removed part of her remains after death, or someone had buried her in pieces from the start. Either way, it changed the scope of the case from a disappearance to something far more disturbing. And worse, they still didn't know where the rest of her was. When investigators traced the property on Sycamore Hill back to its last known occupant, the name on file felt like a footnote that had been ignored for too long. Russell Ames. It hadn't meant much back in 2017. A quiet renter, paid in cash, moved in and out of handyman jobs, mostly unnoticed. But now, with Haley Marin's partial remains uncovered in what used to be his backyard, everything about him took on new weight. Russell Ames was in his mid-40s at the time of Haley's disappearance. No spouse, no children, no social media. He had no prior convictions, no arrests, not even a speeding ticket. His background check came back clean. But clean didn't mean much when the details around someone's life were this sparse. He had lived in that house for roughly 3 years, long enough to be familiar with the neighborhood, long enough to know who walked the trails nearby and when, and just long enough to disappear without anyone really noticing. Neighbors remembered him, though not fondly. One described him as blank, the type who would nod at you from a distance but never speak. Another said she stopped letting her teenage daughter walk their dog alone after Ames moved in. She recalled a moment when she caught him watching the girl from his front porch. Not staring in a way that was outwardly threatening, but lingering, like he was trying to memorize something. A few locals told deputies he gave them a feeling, nothing specific, just off. But feelings don't build cases. Back then, when the search for Haley was fresh and frantic, dozens of names had been reviewed. Ames's address had come up briefly when detectives mapped out properties within a mile radius of the trailhead where Haley's phone had last pinged. Collins remembered visiting him once. He'd seemed cooperative, said he hadn't seen anything, didn't know the girl, and had been home sleeping that morning. No red flags, no evidence. Just another reclusive man who happened to live nearby. Now, his story didn't add up so cleanly. After Haley's disappearance, Ames remained in town for a few months, just long enough to appear unconnected. Then, early in 2018, he abruptly vacated the home on Sycamore Hill. No notice, no forwarding address. A neighbor reported seeing a moving truck late one night, but no one else could verify it. The property owner filed for eviction weeks later. Inside the home, there was minimal furniture, just a stained mattress, an old microwave, and a pile of unopened mail. The utilities had already been shut off. There was no trace of where he'd gone. When the home fell into foreclosure, it sat empty for years, overgrown, boarded, forgotten, until the Rose bought it in early 2025, and until their dog unearthed what Ames had left behind. Investigators now treated him as a person of interest. The problem was there was no sign of him anywhere. He hadn't filed taxes since 2018. No bank activity, no employer records. His last known action, a single ATM withdrawal in Idaho, 3 weeks after leaving Ridgetop Hollow, led nowhere. He hadn't used his Social Security number since. His license had expired. No one matching his description had been arrested, checked into a hospital, or reported missing. It was like he'd planned to disappear, or someone had helped him do it. They canvassed the surrounding counties, but no one remembered him. His old employers couldn't offer much either. He'd taken odd jobs under the table, yard work, drywall repairs, minor plumbing, always alone, never stuck around long enough to form relationships. No friends came forward, no family. There wasn't even an emergency contact on record. He'd kept his life hollow and clean, just enough to pass under every radar until it was too late. But what stuck with Detective Collins wasn't just the disappearance, it was the silence around it. Most people leave a digital shadow, a trail of small, unremarkable details. Grocery store receipts, texts to landlords, calls to service providers. Ames left none of that. No email, no phone calls, no online purchases, not even a trace of a second-hand vehicle. He didn't just walk away from town, he walked away from every system designed to find people. The renewed attention brought new tips, but none were substantial. Someone claimed they saw a man resembling Ames at a bus station in Spokane 3 years ago. Another believed they'd rented him a motel room in Colorado Springs, but when photos were shown, none could confirm the ID. The leads collapsed under scrutiny, like most things in cases that have sat too long. The press caught wind of his name. News reports labeled him the ghost tenant. It wasn't wrong. That's what he'd become, an absence wrapped in questions. In a case full of silence, he stood out as the loudest. Back at the property, investigators continued their search. The ground radar turned up nothing new, no other remains, no hidden crawl spaces. If more of Haley had been there once, it had been removed, or never buried there at all. The garden gave up only what it had been forced to keep. Diane Marin now had a name to fixate on. Someone to direct her questions toward. She printed his photo, one of the only ones ever taken, a blurry ID from his expired license, and taped it to the wall above her case map. It joined the red string and marked timelines in her daughter's smiling face. For the first time in years, she wasn't just waiting. She was watching. But as the days passed and Russell Ames remained invisible, one truth became harder to ignore. If he was alive, he didn't want to be found. And if he wasn't, someone else had helped him disappear. Either way, Haley's story wasn't over. Because the man who might have buried part of her in a garden had vanished without a trace, and someone, somewhere, still knew why. The initial relief that came with identifying the remains didn't last long. The forensic team, after carefully cataloging every fragment pulled from the soil behind the house on Sycamore Hill, came to a troubling conclusion. The grave was incomplete. What they'd recovered wasn't the full picture, not even close. Bones from the lower torso, partial legs, a few vertebrae, and a mandible. But the skull, the ribs, the arms, all of it was missing. It didn't take long to realize this wasn't a burial in the traditional sense. This was something else. The excavation report was clear. The hole had been dug quickly. The edges were shallow, uneven, and collapsed inward in places, like whoever buried her hadn't planned it. There were roots running through the soil that hadn't been cut, only pushed aside. That meant the body hadn't been buried deep enough to prevent interference from nature, which is why Murphy, the rose dog, had been able to dig it up so easily. Whoever did this either didn't have time or didn't care enough to do it right. But one detail stood out: the bracelet. While the bones were brittle and weathered from years underground, the bracelet, Haley's charm bracelet, was oddly preserved. The rusted metal had degraded, but forensic testing showed it had been wiped clean before burial. Not polished, not sterilized, but deliberately cleaned. There were no fingerprints, no oils, no dirt under the charms. Whoever placed it with her had taken the time to clean it first. That detail didn't match the hurried nature of the burial. It didn't fit the chaos of someone in a panic. It felt intentional, personal. The idea unnerved investigators. If the bracelet had been cleaned, it could mean a number of things. It could suggest remorse, a need to preserve some part of her. It could also suggest ritual or control. Killers sometimes return to their victims to pose them, stage items, or attempt to humanize what they've done. But this grave didn't reflect control. It reflected fear. There were still no signs of a full burial, no clothing tags, no remnants of shoes, no evidence of a blanket or tarp. Cadaver dogs searched the surrounding yard again, but turned up nothing. Soil samples suggested there had never been a full-body decomposition in that exact location, just a portion. Which meant the other parts of Haley's remains had either decomposed elsewhere or were still being hidden. What began as a break in the case was starting to feel more like a puzzle that had been deliberately scattered. Investigators revisited every note from the original case, paying new attention to timing. Haley disappeared on October 27, 2017. Ames, who lived in the home at the time, moved out less than 4 months later. If the body, or part of it, was buried in panic, It may have happened shortly before he left. But that raised a bigger question. Why only bury part of her? There were theories. The first was logistical. Maybe Ames had been interrupted. Maybe he intended to move the rest but fled town before he could. But there were no signs of additional digging anywhere else on the property, and no reports of suspicious activity in the days before his departure. The second theory was far darker. That the burial site was symbolic, that the body had been dismembered on purpose, and the part left behind was meant to mislead or even taunt. Forensic anthropologists examined the cuts on the bones. The femur showed scoring, marks from a serrated blade or saw. It wasn't conclusive, but it was enough to support the possibility that dismemberment had occurred post-mortem. That alone was enough to change the classification of the case from abduction to homicide. Then came confirmation. A single molar, still embedded in the recovered jawbone, was matched against Haley's dental records. The match was exact. There was no longer any doubt. It was her. Diane Marin received the call while sitting at her kitchen table. The news didn't bring the closure people expect from headlines. There was no relief in it, no calm, just the sinking knowledge that part of her daughter had been buried in someone else's backyard, while the rest of her was still out there, somewhere. Diane asked only one question. Why just part of her? That became the question at the center of the case. Who would bury a teenage girl piecemeal? And why leave the bracelet? Why clean it first? Investigators considered whether it was someone Haley had trusted, someone who wanted to mark her grave, not as an act of guilt, but as a private message, or worse, a trophy. They looked into whether Ames had ever been linked to other missing persons. Nothing. No pattern, no known history of violence, no formal psychiatric issues on record. But then again, there had never been anything on record. Ames had lived between the margins. No paper trail, no close ties, just a man who arrived, stayed quiet, and left without looking back. And now, they couldn't prove he'd buried her. They had a timeline, a location, and circumstantial evidence. But there were no fingerprints, no DNA tying him to the remains. Without the rest of her body, they couldn't prove how she died. Without the rest of her story, they couldn't charge anyone. So the grave remained unfinished, not just in the physical sense, but in every way that mattered. In the eyes of the law, it was progress. In the eyes of her family, it was another wound, another stretch of empty space between what was known and what had been taken. But the case wasn't closed. Not yet. Because somewhere out there was the rest of Haley Marin, and someone, for whatever reason, had made sure she was never found whole. 9 years after Haley Marin vanished, a torn piece of paper surfaced that would complicate everything. It came from a worn spiral notebook, the kind she used to carry in her backpack throughout high school. Faded pink cover, doodles on the margins, mostly used for homework or idle thoughts. But this page, held onto quietly, folded and hidden for years, was different. It had been removed from the notebook just days before her disappearance. It didn't contain homework or song lyrics or plans for the weekend. It contained a fear she never said out loud. The page was turned in by Mallory Green, Haley's closest friend in the year leading up to her disappearance. They'd walked to school together, eaten lunch together, texted constantly. For years, Mallory had given the impression that she'd already shared everything she knew with investigators. And maybe, back then, she believed she had. But when news of Haley's remains broke, when the bracelet was shown on television, and the name Russell Ames was made public, Mallory reached out to Detective Collins and asked to meet in person. She arrived at the station visibly anxious, carrying a clear plastic folder. Inside was the page. It wasn't long, but it was chilling. Haley had written, "I keep seeing this man when I walk. Same place, just beyond the first turn past the Ridgeview Gate. He never says anything, just stands still like he's pretending to look at the trees. I think he's watching me. It's happened 3 times now. Once I thought I heard him following, but when I turned around, he was gone. Maybe it's nothing. Or maybe I'm being followed." There was a second line underneath that was crossed out, almost completely scribbled over. Forensics would later recover most of it using light filters. Don't tell anyone, he might find out. The entry wasn't dated, but based on surrounding notes recovered from the original notebook, it likely came a week or two before Haley disappeared. Mallory told investigators she hadn't shared it earlier because she didn't realize what it meant, that at the time, she thought it was just a dream Haley had written down. She'd even written the word dream in the top corner. The page was torn out during a sleepover at Mallory's house, one of those late-night moments when they were both writing in journals. Haley had left it behind, or maybe discarded it. Mallory said she kept it because something about it felt real. She never told Haley she'd held onto it. When investigators asked why she was only turning it in now, her explanation was quiet. She said she'd convinced herself it wasn't important, that she was afraid it made her sound crazy, that people would blame her. When pressed further, Mallory admitted she always had a strange feeling about the man Haley had described. That part of her wondered if it could have been real, and that part, small but persistent, had kept her up at night for years. Now, with everything that had surfaced about Russell Ames, the journal entry carried new weight. Ames lived less than a 10-minute walk from the Ridgeview Trail entrance. He worked odd jobs in the area and often walked through the neighborhood with a small toolbox and a drawstring backpack. He wasn't known to speak with anyone unless approached. No one recalled seeing him on the trail specifically, but if Haley was passing him at the same time each morning and he was watching from a distance, it wasn't impossible she'd noticed something no one else had. And if she had sensed danger, it was likely no one believed her. Detectives returned to the original case files to see if there were any missed signs that pointed to a pattern. A few classmates had remembered Haley being nervous in her final weeks. One said she'd started leaving for her morning walks earlier than usual, before the streetlights even clicked off. Another thought she seemed distracted in class, quieter, more withdrawn. But back then, no one connected it to anything more than stress or schoolwork. The journal page reframed it all. It suggested that Haley may have known she was being followed, or at the very least suspected it. It also suggested that she didn't feel safe saying it out loud, that she had been trying to process it silently, through writing, through dreams, through avoidance. And if Russell Ames was the man she saw, the one who never spoke, never moved, just watched, then it's possible she'd been marked weeks before she ever disappeared. The implications were chilling. Diane Marin was shown a copy of the page. She didn't cry. She didn't speak for a long time. But when she did, her response was quiet and cold. She knew, she said. She knew. And she didn't tell me, because she thought I wouldn't believe her. And maybe she wouldn't have. Because when a 16-year-old girl says she feels watched, people assume it's nerves or anxiety or something imagined. They rarely assume it's a warning. The journal entry was submitted as evidence. It wasn't proof, not legally. But to investigators, and to Diane, it was confirmation that Haley's disappearance had never been random, that someone had been watching her long enough to know her habits, to know her route, to know when she'd be alone, and it raised a new question no one had considered before. What if Haley hadn't just vanished? What if she saw it coming? Only part of Haley Marin was ever found. Despite weeks of excavation, multiple sweeps with cadaver dogs, and radar scans of the Sycamore Hill property, the rest of her remains never surfaced. The bones recovered were real, the bracelet unmistakably hers. DNA confirmed what the town had long feared, but in the end, it wasn't a full body that gave her family answers. It was a partial grave, and it raised more questions than it answered. The official report described the burial as shallow and rushed. No signs of a coffin or covering, no attempt at preservation, just plastic wrapped loosely, dirt packed in unevenly, and a charm bracelet placed with too much care to be accidental. Forensic analysts noted that the bracelet had been wiped clean before burial. No fingerprints, no oils, no trace of the person who put it there. But the way it was positioned, visible, tangled with cloth and bone, felt intentional. Not as if it had been tossed in, but placed. It didn't make sense. If someone was in a hurry to hide a body, why take the time to clean a bracelet? If it was panic, why not destroy the object that could identify her? And if it was remorse, why not leave more? Why not call it in? These are the contradictions that haunt unresolved cases. This one was no exception. The working theory remains that Russell Ames, missing since early 2018, was involved in Haley's death. His name is now part of a national bolo, flagged in every federal and state law enforcement system. But no trace of him has surfaced, no license renewal, no employment history, no address, no arrests, nothing. It's as if the day he left Ridgetop Hollow, he stopped existing. And if he had help disappearing, no one's come forward. Detectives still review tips. His name resurfaces every few months in an anonymous call or vague sighting. None have panned out. No surveillance video, no confirmed voice print. He remains a shadow, like the one Haley wrote about in her final journal entry. Her mother visits the garden often, not every day, but regularly. The Rose never protested. They let her sit quietly in the corner, near where the bracelet was found. She doesn't speak during these visits. She just watches the ground. Neighbors say the garden feels colder now, that it holds something heavy even when the sun's out. Some have started referring to it as the first sight, as if there may be others. Whispers circle back to the same idea, that the land around Ridgetop Hollow has more to tell, that what the dog uncovered was only part of the truth. No evidence has confirmed that there are other victims, but absence in these cases doesn't bring comfort. It breeds doubt, and as long as the rest of Haley's body remains missing, the case will never be considered closed. Was it about control? Was she left in pieces because someone wanted it that way? Or was it practical? An interrupted burial, a second location abandoned, a plan that fell apart midway. Investigators have asked these questions quietly for months. So far, there are no answers. Just a bracelet, a name, and a half-filled grave. And somewhere, buried deeper than the bones ever were, is the reason why.